Welcome to Black Sun, where the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains come alive and the stories you hear are closer to reality than you might imagine. Tonight, we follow the chilling tale of campers near Clingman's Dome who faced a fear no one should ever hear in the dead of night. If this story sends shivers down your spine, hit that like button, subscribe, and share your own experiences in the woods in the comments below. Because here, in the heart of the Smokies, you never know what might be listening. I still remember the sound, sharp enough to slice through the cold November air, long enough to settle deep into my bones. It wasn't the wind, and it sure wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. It was a screech that seemed to climb up the dark walls of the valley, hang there, and then fall straight back down on top of us. And to this day, I wish I had trusted my instincts the moment that sound first crawled into the night, because everything that followed only made it worse. My name is Aaron, 27 at the time, and I'd grown up near the western edge of the Great Smoky Mountains. I wasn't a tourist, not someone chasing a view or a moment for social media. I knew the trails, knew the weather, knew how the temperatures could turn on you with no warning. And in November, high on the ridge near Clingman's Dome, the cold didn't just settle in the air, it crawled under your clothes and sat there. But I'd always found comfort in that kind of discomfort. That weekend, though, something felt different, and I didn't tell anyone. I had driven up with two friends, Ben and Carter, locals like me. We'd all grown up hearing stories about the Smokies, the strange lights seen across the ridgelines, unexplained cries in the valleys, hikers who swore they'd been followed for miles by something pacing them just out of sight. Most of the stories faded once you were old enough to understand the woods had a personality of their own. But every now and then you'd hear about someone who didn't come home, and the search parties that dragged through the brush for days. Those stories stayed with you. But we were young, experienced, and maybe a little arrogant. We figured we knew enough to stay safe. We camped just off the Forney Ridge Trail, down a quiet slope most people overlooked because the ground was uneven and scattered with roots. But we liked it that way, secluded, shielded, the kind of spot where you felt the mountain breathing around you. The first night dropped below freezing faster than expected. By the time we'd finished eating, a low fog had started sinking through the trees, settling across the forest floor like something alive, curling around our boots, swallowing the light of the headlamps. It wasn't unusual for the elevation, but it felt heavier than normal, as if the fog weren't just moving, it was watching. Around midnight, when we finally zipped up our tents, the woods were dead quiet. The kind of quiet where every twitch of a branch feels amplified, where your heartbeat starts to sound louder than the leaves under you. I'd camped dozens of nights in that area, but lying in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. I kept listening, trying to match the silence with what I was used to. Distant owls, maybe a coyote cry, wind slipping through the bare branches, but the air stayed stiff and unmoving. Even the insects felt like they'd disappeared. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is waking to the sound of something walking, slow, deliberate, heavy enough to break through the frost-coated underbrush. At first, I thought it was a deer, maybe a black bear cutting across our camp. It was the Smokies, after all. But the steps didn't wander like an animal searching for food. They circled. A full, patient circle around our tents, crunching lightly, pausing now and then, as if listening. As if deciding. My breath froze in my throat, and I didn't even dare move. I waited for Ben or Carter to say something, to unzip their tent, to whisper, to do anything that told me I wasn't the only one hearing it. But their tent stayed silent. The footsteps stopped behind my tent, directly behind my head. I could feel the weight of the stillness pressing in, and for a moment I thought something was leaning over me, separated by nothing but a thin sliver of nylon. I held my breath and counted the seconds, but the seconds stretched, turning into minutes. When the footsteps finally moved away, they didn't wander off into the woods. They went to Ben's tent, I heard the soft thud of something or someone pressing on the fabric. Ben jerked awake. I knew because I heard him suck in a fast breath. Then his whisper, "Aaron, you awake?" I didn't answer. I was afraid if I spoke, whatever stood outside would learn exactly which tent was mine. Another press, this time heavier. Ben's tent wall pushed inward, just a few inches, but enough to show a shape behind it. Something tall, something upright, holding still in a way no bear ever would. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. Whatever circled us didn't come back, but the air never reset to normal. It stayed charged, electric, like the woods were holding their breath. By dawn, the fog had crept so thick around camp that the trees looked like silhouettes sketched with charcoal. We didn't talk about what happened. Not directly. Not yet. But we all had the same exhausted eyes, the same stiff movements, the same shared tension none of us wanted to name. Instead, we did what people do when they're trying to ignore fear. We focused on small tasks. Packing gear, heating water, checking the trail. By mid-morning, the fog finally thinned, but that relief didn't last long. Not once we saw the footprints. They weren't prints from boots or hiking shoes, and they weren't paw prints. They were long, too long, shaped like something that walked upright but didn't belong to a person. The stride was uneven, dragging slightly on one side, cutting shallow grooves in the frost. They circled our tents exactly the way we'd heard the steps the night before, a perfect ring around our campsite. Carter kept saying it had to be melted frost, or the way the fog settled, or maybe some other campers playing tricks. But we were miles from the nearest shelter, and there hadn't been another soul on the trail the entire day before, and melted frost didn't leave a stride pattern. The deeper we followed the tracks, the more the forest seemed to tighten around us. The prints drifted toward the lower part of the ridge, where the valley opened into a stretch of old timber, the kind that creaks even when there's no breeze. The silence thickened as we moved, swallowing our voices, making every branch snap echo far louder than it should have. At one point, Ben stopped walking altogether. He pressed his hand against a tree, his breathing shallow. "You hear that?" he whispered. I didn't at first. But then the wind shifted, and something faint drifted through the valley. A low hum, almost like a whistle. Not melodic, not natural, more like something trying to mimic a sound it didn't quite understand. We froze. The hum rose to a pitch just barely audible, then cut off so abruptly it left the woods feeling even emptier than before. And that's when we heard it. The screech. High, sharp, splintering through the trees with a force that made the ground seem to tremble under our boots. It echoed off the valley walls, bouncing, stretching, repeating until it sounded like the whole forest was screaming. Ben dropped to the ground, hands over his ears. Carter swore under his breath. I couldn't move. My legs locked, my chest tight, because that sound wasn't from any animal that lived in those mountains. It was something else. Too long, too ragged in the middle, too human at the beginning, too wrong at the end. And worst of all, it was close. The woods fell silent so quickly after that screech that it felt like the trees themselves were holding still, afraid to rustle. I remember looking at Ben, still crouched with his hands pressed tight against his ears, and then at Carter, who was slowly lifting himself back upright, eyes tracking the tree line as if expecting something to step out at any moment. I didn't move, couldn't. The cold air stung as I breathed it in, and every muscle felt wired, ready to snap. Whatever made that sound wasn't trying to scare us. It was warning us, or calling to something, or signaling in a way we didn't understand. And the part that bothered me most was how the sound seemed to come from several directions at once, like the mountains themselves were echoing it back with too much clarity. We backed away without speaking, returning to camp with far more urgency than we wanted to show. None of us wanted to admit we were spooked, even though the fear sat openly on each of our faces. When we reached the tents, the prints were still there, circling the perimeter. A reminder, a boundary, as if something had marked the spot overnight. Carter kept glancing at them while he stuffed gear into his pack. "We need to head down," he muttered. Not later. Now. Ben nodded immediately. I should have agreed, but something gnawed at me. A wrongness. A feeling I'd overlooked something earlier, something small but important. It hit me when I noticed the quiet again. The kind of quiet that doesn't belong in any forest, even on the coldest days. No birds, no squirrels, not even the distant sound of branches knocking together. The silence wasn't natural. It was deliberate, heavy, like the whole forest was listening. I felt eyes on us, though every time I turned, the fog, the trees, the thin blades of cold morning light looked unchanged. But the sensation wouldn't shake. The same crawling awareness from the night before, only stronger now. More focused. It made my heartbeat pulse in my throat. We didn't bother eating. We didn't bother checking the trail map. We grabbed what we needed, tore down what we could, and shoved the rest into our packs. By the time we started hiking out, the sky had darkened again. Not with clouds, but with that flat winter light that makes the air look washed out, colorless. It was barely past noon, but the ridge already felt like late evening. At first, the trail felt normal enough. The ground was stiff with frost, the roots slick under our boots. Our breath came out in thin, cloudy bursts. But about half a mile down, we noticed the tracks again, the same elongated, dragging marks cutting through the frost. This time, they weren't circling. They were parallel to our trail, following it, following us. Ben stopped dead in the trail. "It's tracking us," he whispered. Carter shook his head, but he didn't offer an explanation. He didn't have one. None of us did. I stepped closer to the tracks, crouching to see them better, but I regretted it instantly. The drag marks on the right side were deeper than before, as if whatever had made them was leaning heavier on that side now. Or closer. Maybe both. We quickened our pace, but the deeper we went, the more the trail seemed to close in. The trees leaned closer together, the fog thickened around our legs, and the air hung heavy with a damp cold that felt unnatural for the elevation. And then the wind picked up. Slow at first, then faster, dragging a low whistle through the pines. Except the whistle wasn't random. It followed a rhythm, a pattern, almost like speech. The hairs on my arms rose as I realized the sound wasn't blowing across the forest. It was coming from directly ahead of us on the trail. We stopped as one, listening. The whistling rose, dipped, stretched out wrong. I'd heard wind whistle through the mountains my whole life. This wasn't that. This had intention. It had shape. It sounded like someone trying to copy a human voice without fully understanding how a human voice worked. Ben whispered, "Tell me that's the wind." Neither of us answered. The sound drifted closer, slow and steady, rising and falling like breath. Then it stopped, and the woods held their breath with it. We waited, too scared to move, too scared to speak. Then the screech tore through the valley again. Closer this time, much closer. It hit with so much force, I stumbled back half a step. Carter grabbed my sleeve, pulling me forward. "Move," he hissed. No hesitation now. We ran. Not recklessly, not sprinting blindly. We knew better than that. But every step was laced with fear, every crunch of the frost underfoot sounding louder than it should have. The trail narrowed, then wound sharply, and that's when we saw it. Ahead of us, a tree about 20 yards off the trail had deep gouges carved into the bark, fresh, raw, not from claws or antlers or anything I'd seen in the Smokies before. They were long, uneven, tearing down the trunk at an angle that suggested something had dragged its hand or limb straight down the side. We froze, not because of the scratches, but because of what lay at the base of the tree. A shredded piece of fabric, blue, nylon, the kind used in lightweight jackets. Ben stepped forward slowly, bending down to lift it. But before he even touched it, Carter grabbed his arm. His voice was a low whisper. "That's from your jacket." Ben looked down at his sleeve. A jagged tear ran along the seam, one he hadn't noticed, one that hadn't been there when we left camp, and the missing piece matched the color exactly. Something had touched him sometime in the night. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. Panic doesn't need words. We pushed forward faster now, our steps desperate, our breaths loud enough to break the unnatural silence pressing around us. But the deeper we went, the clearer it became that we weren't outrunning anything. The whistling sound followed alongside us, weaving between the trees, sometimes close, sometimes far, sometimes so faint we weren't sure if we'd imagined it. The screech didn't return, not yet, but its absence didn't bring comfort. It brought dread. The kind of dread that tells you the thing you're running from is getting closer, not louder. The trail ahead split, one direction leading toward Clingman's Dome Road, the other dipping deeper into the valley. We aimed for the road. Safety, people, distance from whatever haunted the ridgeline. But before we could take 3 steps down that direction, the whistling sound rose sharply from the right, fast, impossibly fast, cutting us off. Not ahead, not behind, right next to us, only a few yards into the tree line. Ben froze. Carter cursed under his breath. My legs locked as the sound shifted, no longer a whistle, no longer wind trying to imitate a voice. It was breathing. Slow, wet, labored, only feet away. We didn't run this time. Running meant noise, running meant blind panic. Instead, we backed away, stepping onto the other fork of the trail, the deeper path, the wrong path, the one that led away from people and help. But in that moment, the choice didn't feel like ours to make. It felt forced. We moved in near silence, and the breathing faded. But just as we let our guard slip for half a second, just long enough to believe the danger was behind us, the forest ahead released a new sound, a low, dragging step, then another, then another. Something was on the trail in front of us, and this time it wasn't circling, it was waiting. We froze on the trail, the 3 of us pressed together, breaths shallow, hearts hammering in the same rhythm that made it impossible to think clearly. The dragging steps came closer, slow, deliberate, leaving those same long, uneven grooves across the frost that we'd seen before. There was no mistaking it this time. The prints weren't random. The creature, or whatever it was pacing us, waiting, judging. I could feel its presence like a weight, a physical pressure in the air that pressed against our chests and made our lungs ache. The forest around us had gone completely silent again, as if it, too, was holding its breath, letting the unknown stalk us for its own amusement. Carter finally whispered, barely audible, "We need to climb, higher, the ridge, the lookout." It was the only thing that made sense. At least from up there, there might be a chance to see it, to understand what we were dealing with, or maybe just to give ourselves a few seconds of distance. We didn't argue. We moved fast, boots crunching over frost and fallen branches, sweat mixing with cold as our fear drove us faster than any sense of caution. The trail twisted sharply upward, steep and narrow, roots snaking across every step like grasping fingers. Every so often, the dragging sound would pause, and then resume just behind us, closer each time, so close that the echo bounced from tree to tree and felt like it was inside our heads. And then it happened. Something snapped, a branch, maybe 20 feet up the slope, high above us. The sound was small, but the timing made it impossible to ignore. Whatever followed us could climb, and it could climb fast. I glanced back. There was nothing visible, only mist curling through the trees, but the sensation of being watched intensified. Ben was breathing hard, hands tight on his trekking poles, eyes darting in every direction, while Carter kept muttering under his breath, as if speaking aloud could protect us from whatever followed. I wanted to agree. I wanted to tell them everything would be fine, but I didn't. I didn't even tell myself that. Finally, we broke through the last stretch of dense timber and spilled out onto the bare ridge near the Clingman's Dome observation tower. The view should have been breathtaking, the valley stretched out below, the fog like a rolling sea of white. But there was no awe, no wonder. The mountains themselves seemed oppressive, the ridges slicing the horizon like jagged teeth. And there, at the edge of the fog, not not enough to understand it completely. Just a shadow, hunched, long-limbed with movements that weren't quite human, scaling the slope below us. Its head snapped toward the trail, and for a moment I swore I saw eyes. Pale, reflecting the low winter light. It didn't make a sound, not yet. It just stared. And I felt something deep in my gut twist with recognition. Whatever this was, it knew we were alive. It had tracked us, it had followed, and it had chosen to wait. Carter grabbed my arm, shaking me. "We can't stay. We need to descend. Now." His voice was urgent, flat, stripped of hope. Ben nodded silently, scanning the ridge for any other escape route. The observation tower itself loomed ahead, empty except for the skeletal frame of its structure. We ran toward it, boots sliding on frost and scattered gravel. The shadow didn't move for a long moment, only watching, waiting, letting us think we had a chance. Once inside the tower, we climbed to the platform, shivering in every sense of the word. From there, we had a view of the surrounding mountains, the valley below, and the fog creeping through the lower ridges. And from that height, I could see nothing. No trace, no tracks. But I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. Testing the boundaries. We didn't speak. The cold bit into our faces, but it was nothing compared to the icy terror sitting in our chests. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time didn't feel real up there. We didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply. And then the wind shifted, carrying a sound that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. A faint, almost human-like scream, thin, high-pitched, and echoing across the valley. Not once, but twice. And with it came the memory of the screech that had started this nightmare, the one that had frozen us in the middle of the night, the screech that had marked the boundary of whatever had been circling us. The fog began to rise, thin and restless, swirling around the base of the tower. The temperature dropped again, sudden and sharp. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the realization that we weren't safe, not anywhere. Not on the ridge, not on the trail, not in the valleys. It wasn't hunting us like a predator, not like an animal. It was observing, waiting, learning. Eventually, daylight began to bleed across the horizon. The fog thinned enough for us to see the valley clearly, and we made a decision. We couldn't stay, couldn't linger. We descended carefully, avoiding the trail as much as possible, slipping through brush and undergrowth to reach the main road below. The prints from before were gone, or maybe they had just faded with the frost. The dragging sound had stopped. The screech hadn't returned. But the fear didn't leave us. It followed in our minds, in the way we looked over our shoulders, in the tremor of our hands as we climbed into my car and drove back down toward Gatlinburg. We didn't speak of it again, not in detail, not until months later when each of us separately realized the same thing. The forest had marked us, not with scratches, not with injuries, not with any traceable evidence, but in memory, in awareness, in the knowledge that something we couldn't name, couldn't categorize, had watched us, tested our courage and let us go, but only because it chose to. Even now, years later, I can hear that screech if I think too hard about it. Not in real life, not in the woods I now hike safely in, but in memory. High, piercing, stretching from ridge to valley, echoing as if the mountains themselves were crying. It reminds me that some places, some nights aren't just dangerous because of weather or terrain or inexperience. They're dangerous because the woods have a consciousness of their own. Because in some corners of the Smokies, the shadows aren't just shadows. And sometimes when you camp near Klingman's Dome late in November, you hear something that doesn't belong to this world. Something that lets you know you are small, fleeting, fragile. Something that watches patiently and maybe, if you're lucky, lets you leave. The first night on the Appalachian Trail near Roan Mountain hit me like the cold March wind cutting through the hollows, sharp and unrelenting. My name is Garrett, I'm 27, and I've been hiking these mountains since I was a teenager, chasing that particular quiet that only the woods can offer. Until that night, when the quiet seemed to watch me back. I had chosen a small clearing not far from the old orchard trailhead, a spot locals had warned me about, though they spoke of it half-jokingly, as if the woods themselves had moods and whims. I set up my tent under the skeleton of a tall oak, its branches swaying with a groan that sounded almost like a warning. The smell of damp leaves and pine needles filled the air, thick and earthy, and the wind whispered through the ridges, like it had secrets it couldn't hold inside. The hike that day had been unusually quiet. Even the birds seemed to keep their distance, leaving only the crunch of my boots over the frozen earth and the occasional snap of a twig to accompany me. I remember checking my map and realizing that the trail markers were spaced farther apart than usual. The signs looked faded, almost hesitant, like someone or something had been there before me, erasing my sense of certainty. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had dipped below the mountain's jagged horizon, leaving the sky bruised with purple and gray. I built a small fire, the flames flickering like nervous spirits, and I watched them dance as the chill sank deeper into my bones. That's when I noticed it, a faint golden light hovering at the edge of the trees, just beyond the reach of the fire. At first, I assumed it was another camper, someone who had arrived after dark, maybe carrying a lantern like I had the last time I hiked with friends. But as I squinted through the dimness, I realized there was no movement, no human shape, no sound, nothing but the small, steady glow that bobbed gently in the wind. I called out, my voice cracking slightly in the cold. "Hello? Anyone there?" The light didn't respond. It didn't move toward me or away from me. It just hung luminous, like it had its own purpose. My heart began to race. Something in me recognized a presence, though I couldn't see its form. 100 stories from fellow hikers about strange lights in the mountains came rushing to me at once, and I wanted to laugh at my own fear, but the laugh never came. I tried to focus on rational explanations. Maybe it was a reflection off a shard of ice, or someone had left a lantern hanging in the trees as a trail marker. I shook my head, telling myself that the wind couldn't hold a flame in midair for this long, and yet the light remained, steady and unyielding. I packed my fire down to embers, figuring that the glow might be easier to observe without interference. I grabbed my flashlight, stepping carefully onto the frozen underbrush, following the light at a distance. With each step, the forest seemed to tighten around me. The branches lowered as if watching, the shadows stretching in ways that made the trees look alive. I felt exposed, like the mountains themselves had shifted from being my refuge to being an audience, silently judging my curiosity. I kept moving toward the light until I realized I was walking in circles. Every familiar marker I thought I recognized, an odd rock formation, a split in the path, a hollowed log, appeared in the same configuration, as if the forest had rearranged itself. Panic began to creep in, cold and heavy, curling into my chest. I stopped and shone my flashlight directly on the glow. For a split second, I could see that the light hung perfectly midair, with no one holding it, no wire, no string, nothing. My mind scrambled for explanations, for rationality, but there was none that fit. My hands shook as I tried to reach it, and when I did, it wavered slightly, like a candle flickering in a gentle breeze. But there was no wind here, no wind at all. The night grew darker, and the forest seemed to close in. Every sound, the snapping of a branch under my boot, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified, exaggerated, almost deliberate. I could feel eyes on me, not human ones, but something that belonged to the deep woods, to the shadows themselves. And then I heard it. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the blackness, but there was nothing. The air held tight around me, suffocating in its silence. I turned back toward the light, and it was gone. Completely gone. I thought perhaps I had imagined it, that my mind had played tricks in the isolation, in the tension of the long, empty hike. But then the breathing returned, closer now, not behind me, but all around me, as if the trees themselves exhaled. I sprinted back toward my camp, heart hammering, limbs trembling. When I arrived, my fire had almost died, leaving a cold circle of ash and shadows. I piled more wood into it, striking sparks until the flames roared again. That's when I saw it again, flickering at the edge of the clearing, just past the oak. It hadn't moved, and I knew with a certainty that left no room for doubt. No one carried that lantern. I felt a strange, twisting fear, not of being physically harmed, but of being watched, evaluated, understood in ways I could not fathom. I shouted, demanded answers from the shadows, my voice breaking, but there was no response. Only the gentle, stubborn glow, like a heartbeat just out of reach. I stayed up that night, the fire crackling low, every shadow a potential doorway into something I did not know. I tried to rationalize it again, convinced myself I was losing perspective, that the isolation had broken me a little at the edges. I told myself that the Appalachian Trail held mysteries, yes, but that I was still safe. And yet, when I finally drifted into a shallow, trembling sleep, I dreamed of the lantern moving through the trees, past unseen eyes that watched me, past rocks and streams that shifted beneath my feet. I woke once with the fire nearly out, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw a figure emerge from the darkness. But when I blinked, the clearing was empty. Just the wind, whispering. Just the echo of a light that no one held. By morning, the forest seemed ordinary again. Birds returned to the branches, the wind softened to a gentle murmur, and the trail markers appeared in familiar places. But the memory of that light haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it hovering, unwavering, between the trees, unclaimed. I hiked down that day with a careful step, eyes darting, ears straining. I spoke to a few locals near the trailhead about it. Some smiled knowingly, recounting stories of hikers seeing lanterns that floated without holders, strange orbs that appeared near the ridge lines in the dead of winter. None of them seemed surprised that it had happened, but their calm didn't ease my nerves. It only confirmed that the forest had its own rules, its own sentience, and my presence was merely a temporary intrusion. Since that night, I've returned to Roan Mountain, never to that exact clearing, never in March. I've hiked other trails, seen other things, eyes in the dark, footprints where no one should have been, but nothing moved with the same patient deliberation as that lantern. It was not malevolent, not in the way a predator is, but it was aware, observing, a reminder that the woods are alive in ways we cannot measure, that some things exist just out of our reach, and sometimes the safest course is to leave them undisturbed. I tell this story not to frighten, but to warn. Those mountains have memory, and sometimes they remember you. The light you saw may not belong to anyone, but it belongs there, tethered to a realm where the trail ends and the unknown begins. Even weeks after I returned home, the memory of that lantern refused to fade. At night, I would wake with a sudden start, convinced I could see a tiny golden glow dancing just beyond the bedroom curtains, hovering impossibly in the corner of the room. My friends thought I was joking when I recounted it, but I could see it in their eyes, the kind of disbelief that hides a sliver of unease, the instinct to pretend the world is entirely rational, even when it isn't. I tried to dismiss it as exhaustion, as a mind stretched too thin by isolation, but rationality offered no comfort. Every sound outside, leaves scraping against the siding, the distant hum of a car, triggered a memory of the deep, deliberate breathing in the woods, and my pulse would spike like I was still running through that frozen clearing. I returned to my journal, the one I carried on all hikes, and wrote every detail I could remember, each observation of the light, every twist of the wind, every whisper of the trees. Writing became a ritual, a tether to reality when the memory threatened to slip into myth. I noted how the lantern had stayed just at the edge of the clearing, never coming closer, never retreating, like it was maintaining its own boundary, a silent guardian of some unseen rule. I replayed the moments when I thought I saw a figure emerge from the shadows, only to vanish instantly. I tried to map its movements, theorize patterns, but the forest had been careful, deliberate, keeping its secrets while letting me glimpse only enough to be unsettled. Sleep remained uneasy. I began dreaming of the lantern again, but the dreams changed. It no longer hovered passively. It moved, weaving through the trees, casting long, fractured shadows, illuminating glimpses of shapes that shouldn't exist, twisted branches that resembled faces, rocks that seemed to shift under my gaze, and paths that looped impossibly back on themselves. I could feel a presence behind me, patient, unblinking, aware of every heartbeat, every shallow breath. I woke drenched in sweat, my body trembling as if I had run the trails all over again. I realized the fear had seeped into me, subtle, persistent, shaping my perception even in the mundane world. Months passed, and I returned to the Appalachian Trail, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and compulsion. I didn't go back to that exact clearing. Instead, I hiked nearby, hoping proximity would offer some insight into what I had seen. Locals I spoke to shared their own stories of lanterns, of shapes glimpsed from the corner of the eye, of hikers who vanished without a trace. They never spoke of it with fear, only with a quiet acceptance, almost reverence, as if the forest had its own laws that no human could understand. I realized then that what I experienced wasn't a warning or a threat. It was a test of awareness, a challenge to see and yet not to interfere. I started noticing details I had ignored before. The patterns of the trees, the subtle shifts in the wind, the way shadows pooled differently around certain rocks and hollows. I walked with a more deliberate pace, conscious of being observed, conscious of the unspoken rules that had governed my first encounter. One evening, near sunset, I thought I saw it again, the faint glimmer of a lantern, impossibly distant, floating at the ridge's edge. My heart thumped violently, the same tight knot of fear I remembered, but I didn't move toward it this time. I watched instead, breathing carefully, letting the forest have its moment. The light stayed briefly steady and calm, then vanished into the deepening shadows. And in that absence, I felt something shift inside me, a strange combination of relief and understanding. I didn't need to chase it, didn't need to confront it. Whatever it was, whatever force had lingered in that clearing, it existed beyond my comprehension, and the only choice I had was to respect its presence, to witness without demanding explanation. The months of reflection changed me. My fear didn't vanish entirely, but it matured into something subtler. A cautious respect, a recognition that not all mysteries are meant to be solved, that the mountains keep a ledger of those who enter and exit, and that some experiences mark you indelibly, altering how you perceive the world forever. I carry that night with me, not as trauma, but as a reminder of how alive the woods are, how patient and deliberate the natural world can be when it chooses to show a flicker of itself. Every hike I take now, every campsite I set up carries that awareness. I am never alone in the woods, not truly, and I walk more carefully, more thoughtfully, aware that the land remembers. Even now, on quiet nights in my apartment, I sometimes see the glow. Not in the room, not tangible, but in the edges of my vision, in the way shadows stretch against the walls, in the peripheral flicker of the streetlight outside. It's never threatening, never malicious, just a reminder that the world holds spaces untouched by human logic, where light and life follow rules I cannot name. And every time I think I understand it, every time I convince myself I am safe in the rational world, I remember the cold March wind, the frozen clearing, the oak's skeleton branches, and the lantern light that floated without hands. I remember what it feels like to know the mountains are aware of you, to feel that presence brushing against the edges of your mind, and I know that some mysteries are meant to haunt, not harm. I never thought the sound of a zipper could freeze me to my core, not until that night in August 2018 at Stone Mountain State Park, North Carolina. I was 24, freshly graduated, craving solitude and a break from the relentless hum of city life. The Appalachians had always drawn me in with their quiet, unhurried beauty, and Stone Mountain, with its towering granite cliffs and dense woodland, promised the kind of isolation I craved. I'd planned the trip meticulously, a 3-day solo camping adventure, a modest pack, a small tent, and the assumption that the woods, no matter how wild, were predictable if treated with respect. I'd hiked before, but never alone overnight, and certainly never in a place that felt so alive with unseen eyes. Setting up camp had been easier than expected. The evening air carried a coolness that promised relief from the late summer heat, and the smell of damp pine and fallen leaves was intoxicating. I chose a small clearing near the edge of the forest, far enough from the trail to feel hidden, but close enough that a morning wander wouldn't leave me lost. I pitched my tent carefully, double-checked the stakes, and sat back to watch the last glow of sun spill over the granite cliffs. Birds called softly, and somewhere in the distance a stream gurgled over rocks. It felt peaceful, sacred even, a rare stillness that seemed to exist just for me. I remember thinking, almost arrogantly, that this was the kind of night I'd remember for the rest of my life. Quiet, beautiful, and untouched by anything human. Night fell quickly in the mountains. The woods changed character as shadows thickened and the air grew heavier. I cooked a small dinner over my compact stove, listening to the forest settle around me. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a chill that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped my tent securely, and tried to quiet the restless anticipation that comes with being entirely alone in the wilderness. That's when it started, the subtle sound that at first I dismissed as the wind, a faint, deliberate tug, like a small hand pulling at the zipper of my tent. I froze. For a long moment, I told myself it was nothing, a trick of the night, the way shadows and sounds play together in the forest. But then it came again, slow, methodical, deliberate. A zipper being drawn from the outside. Heart pounding, I sat up inside my tent. The mesh of the tent walls revealed nothing but darkness, the familiar shapes of trees and rocks blurred by the dim moonlight. My rational mind tried to offer explanations. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a loose branch brushing against the tent. But rationality felt fragile in that moment, like a thin thread stretched across a chasm. The sound repeated, closer this time. My hand instinctively reached for the small pocket knife I kept under my pillow, but my fingers shook violently, making the steel feel slippery and distant. I whispered to myself, reminding myself to breathe, to remember that fear could be a liar. I had learned in other hikes that panic made the woods far more dangerous than any creature. Minutes passed, or maybe an hour. Time became meaningless. Each scrape of the zipper sounded like it was inside my skull, a slow countdown I could not escape. I tried to convince myself it was impossible for someone to be there. Stone Mountain was isolated, and I had seen no one on the trails all day. Still, instinct clawed at me. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as I remembered the small gaps in my tent flap, the places a determined intruder could manipulate. I dared not unclip the zipper fully, yet I could not ignore the sound either. I whispered into the night, "Go away," though I knew no one would hear. The forest remained silent, save for that cruel metallic rasp of the zipper. I finally made a choice. Slowly, carefully, I unzipped just a small triangle of the tent's flap and peered into the shadows. Nothing. The trees swayed gently, the leaves rustled, and the moon cast jagged, moving shapes across the forest floor. I saw nothing alive, yet the sense of being watched settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I retreated, sealing my tent with trembling hands, and pressed my back against the fabric, listening. The sounds stopped abruptly, leaving a hollow void that felt heavier than any noise. I lay awake the rest of the night, my mind racing through every scenario, every mistake I could have made. The woods were patient, but they were not forgiving. I realized somewhere deep inside that fear itself could be just as dangerous as any predator in these mountains. Morning did not bring relief, only light filtered through a mist that hung low over the trees. I left the tent zipped but slightly ajar, stepping into the crisp air with a cautious respect that bordered on reverence. Nothing had touched my camp, nothing had stolen my gear, and yet the memory of the zipper, the sound of it moving of its own accord, clung to me. I packed quickly, eager to leave, but aware that I had learned something vital. The forest carries its own intelligence, its own rhythm, and even the most mundane night can twist into something unfamiliar, something that reminds you of your vulnerability. I hiked back along the trail, the granite cliffs bathed in morning light, but the fear had not left me. Every snapping twig, every sudden bird call made my heart skip. I had come seeking solitude, yet what I carried home was a vivid reminder that nature is never entirely silent and never entirely safe. By the time I returned to my car, I felt changed. Not in a way that grandiose cliches attempt to describe, but in a quiet, insistent awareness. There is a lesson in every detail of the woods, in the unpredictability of night, and in the thin line between peace and panic. That night at Stone Mountain was not just a story about a zipper slowly opening by itself. It was a confrontation with the unknown, a reminder of how fragile we are when we step beyond the familiar, and how memory can haunt us long after the physical danger has passed. Even now, years later, I hear that rasp of metal in my mind when the night is still, and I am reminded that some encounters are less about the monsters outside and more about the fear we carry inside us, amplified by shadows, silence, and the imagination of a lone traveler under the Appalachian sky. The day stretched on in an uneasy blur. Even though I had returned to the main trail, my senses remained on high alert, as though the forest had imprinted itself on my nervous system and refused to release its grip. Every rustle of leaves made me pause. Every bird call carried a note of accusation or warning. I couldn't tell if my fear was rational or if my mind was replaying the previous night on a loop, twisting shadows into threats. At one point, I caught myself scanning behind every tree, convinced I might see a figure slipping through the underbrush, only to find nothing but squirrels and the occasional deer. Still, the tension lingered, like a low hum vibrating beneath the surface of reality, impossible to ignore. By late afternoon, I had reached a small clearing near a stream, the kind of place hikers linger for a break. I sat on a rock, dipping my hands into the cold water, trying to ground myself. It should have been calming, but my muscles refused to relax. I realized that my fear from the night before had evolved. It wasn't just about the zipper anymore. It was about trust, or the absence of it. Could I trust my own perception? Could I trust the forest, or was every sound, every shadow a prelude to something I couldn't understand? For the first time in my life, I felt a primal need for certainty in a place where certainty simply didn't exist. The forest grew quieter as the afternoon waned, shadows lengthening along the granite outcrops. I remembered reading about the park's history, about hikers who had gone missing, and the occasional report of people seeing figures among the cliffs at night. Rationally, I knew the stories were likely exaggerated, folklore mixed with fear, but the effect was undeniable. Every instinct screamed to stay alert. I decided to make camp again, but closer to the stream where I could hear running water, a small comfort against the silence that had become suffocating. Setting up the tent, I double-checked everything, tightening stakes, ensuring the rainfly was secure, and, most importantly, the zipper flap was reinforced. The events of the previous night had drilled into me a meticulous attention to detail I hadn't known I possessed. Night came again, faster than I anticipated, and with it, the forest seemed to shift once more. The breeze carried strange scents of wet earth, pine resin, and something faintly acrid that I couldn't identify. I tried to eat, tried to distract myself with a book, but every noise, every shadow crossing the tent made my pulse quicken. Then, just as I was beginning to convince myself the previous night had been an anomaly, I heard it again, a faint, deliberate scraping sound along the tent's zipper. My stomach dropped. I froze, holding my breath, counting heartbeats. It wasn't as loud this time, more like a whisper, almost hesitant. I told myself it must be an animal, a small creature brushing against the fabric, and yet the rationalizations offered no comfort. Something about the rhythm, the slow, measured tug, was undeniably intentional. I pressed myself flat against the back of the tent, trying to slow my breathing, my mind racing through scenarios. The knife was there, yes, but even the thought of confronting whatever might be outside made my stomach churn. I whispered to myself, again, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing. But the sound didn't relent. It seemed to circle the perimeter of the tent, brushing closer, retreating, then returning in a pattern that no wind or animal could replicate. I tried shining my flashlight through the mesh, careful not to give away the light, and caught a movement, just a shadow, vague and indistinct, but undeniably human-shaped. My hands shook as I fumbled with the zipper from the inside, sealing the tent as tightly as I could, pressing my back to the mesh, hoping that if there was someone there, they would go away. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, though I could not tell. The forest outside remained alive with subtle, almost conspiratorial sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, a distant owl calling, and that infernal metallic whisper of the zipper. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the flap slowly moving, a hand sliding in, fingers brushing against the fabric. My mind began cataloging every possible entry point, every potential vulnerability. By the time the first gray light of dawn seeped into the forest, I felt hollowed out, drained, a creature more alert than human, more paranoid than sane. The night had taught me lessons I hadn't sought, about vigilance, about fear, and about the fragile line between confidence and complacency in the woods. When the morning fully arrived, I emerged cautiously from my tent. The ground around me was undisturbed. No footprints, no evidence of intrusion, just the soft, moist dirt of the forest floor. The absence of proof was more unnerving than any evidence could have been. I packed quickly, my movements brisk and precise, every knot tied and stake removed with near ritualistic care. Even as I hiked down the trail toward the parking area, the memory of the night remained vivid, etched into my senses. Each crack of a branch beneath my boots echoed in my mind, a reminder of the presence I could not explain, the threat I could not see, and the vulnerability I had lived through. By the time I reached my car, I was shaking, not from exhaustion, but from the lingering adrenaline, from the confrontation with the unknown that had refused to show itself fully. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the road ahead, aware that part of me wanted to tell the story, and part of me wanted to leave it buried in the forest, a secret between the trees and the granite cliffs. That night at Stone Mountain didn't just scare me. It changed my perception of the woods entirely. I learned that fear is not an illusion, but a guide, that the silence of the mountains carries weight, and that solitude, while beautiful, carries its own hidden terrors. Even now, whenever I camp alone, I carry the memory of that zipper, the methodical sound that seemed to mock my sense of safety, the knowledge that in the mountains, the line between ordinary night and horror can be thinner than the fabric of a tent. The Appalachian forests are not malevolent, but they are aware, patient, and utterly indifferent. And in that indifference, they teach lessons sharper than any blade. Respect the unknown, trust your instincts, and never underestimate the quiet intelligence of the woods. Some encounters leave scars you cannot see, shadows that linger long after the sun has risen, and for me, that night became a permanent measure of the fine balance between adventure and vulnerability, curiosity and caution, solitude, and the undeniable presence of something watching just beyond the zipper. I remember the exact moment I realized something in the woods wasn't right, though at the time I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than the cold December wind threading through the pines. My name is Alex. I was 28 then, and I had driven from Knoxville with two friends, Mark and Lila, chasing the promise of a quiet weekend in Harlan County, Kentucky. We were the sort of campers who carried too much gear and too little patience for small talk. People who preferred the smell of damp earth and pine over neon lights and background noise. We arrived just before sunset, the forest already draped in that deep, almost bruised shade of winter twilight, and set up our small cluster of tents in a clearing that felt isolated yet oddly welcoming. The fire crackled between us, a modest barrier against the sudden chill, and for a while everything seemed right. The kind of right that comes before everything goes wrong. At first, the signs were subtle. The first oddity was a set of footprints in the snow near the edge of the clearing, too large for any of us, and heading straight toward the tree line before vanishing. Mark joked about Bigfoot, he always did, but even his laughter sounded hollow against the low, constant whistle of the wind through the hills. By nightfall, the woods had swallowed the daylight, and we huddled close to the fire, sharing a thermos of coffee and trying to ignore the sense of being watched. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows. He was tall, his coat threadbare and streaked with mud, and he moved like someone who had been walking for hours or days without rest. There was nothing threatening about him at first glance. He simply appeared silent and oddly calm, standing just beyond the reach of our firelight, as if he'd always been part of the clearing's darkness. We froze. Lila was the first to speak, her voice tight. "Can we help you?" she asked. The man nodded slightly, almost mechanically, and stepped closer, though never close enough to touch the light. His eyes were the color of wet stone, unyielding, and his hands hung limp at his sides. "Lost," he finally said, his voice low and hollow, echoing just enough to make the forest feel alive. Mark, trying to keep the tension from overtaking us, offered him a cup of coffee. He accepted it, but there was no warmth in his hands, no gratitude, just acceptance, like it was part of some ritual we weren't meant to understand. He didn't sit, didn't speak beyond that single word, and when he walked, it was without sound. I remember thinking how unnatural it was, the way the snow seemed to swallow the sound of his steps, as though the forest itself wanted to keep him hidden. We tried to engage him, to ask where he had come from, to offer food or help, but the answers never came. He would shake his head slightly, glance at the fire, and simply stand or wander just beyond our reach, disappearing behind the trees only to reappear moments later. Hours passed, and the forest's quiet was punctuated only by the snap of a distant branch or the sudden rustle of leaves. At one point, I thought I saw him near the creek, his reflection mirrored in the dark water, a silhouette that didn't belong in the natural world. The hair on my neck prickled, a warning I couldn't ignore, but there was no logical reason to panic. Not yet. And then, as abruptly as he arrived, he was gone. 1 minute, the cold air bore the faint imprint of his presence, and the next, he had vanished, leaving only the soft footprints fading in the snow and a lingering unease that refused to dissipate. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the tent poles, every whisper of wind, felt amplified in the darkness. I remember lying awake, counting seconds and trying to rationalize, but the rational part of my mind kept being drowned out by a persistent nagging sensation that he was still out there, somewhere beyond the firelight, watching, waiting. Lila whispered that she thought she saw him crouched in the trees, staring. But whenever we turned to look, there was nothing but shadows and frost-covered branches. Mark suggested we leave in the morning, that the combination of isolation and winter had played tricks on us, but deep down, I knew the fear wasn't coming from imagination. It was coming from the reality of what we had just witnessed, the tangible strangeness of a man who existed without explanation, without story, and who had entered our world long enough to unsettle it completely. By sunrise, the forest seemed almost innocent, but the footprints were still there, fading slowly as the snow continued to fall. The man had left no traces beyond his path, no belongings, no sign of struggle or accident. We packed our gear quickly, moving with a nervous efficiency born from exhaustion and a need to escape the invisible pressure that had settled around us. As we hiked back toward the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something older than the forest itself, something that had been patient enough to wait for travelers foolish enough to wander too deep. Even weeks later, the encounter replayed in my mind, uninvited, the hollow voice, the silent approach, the impossibility of understanding. I found myself looking over my shoulder when walking through familiar places, half expecting to glimpse that same outline between the trees, unchanged and unfathomable. We returned to Harlan County months later, trying to make sense of what had happened, talking to locals about winter wanderers and strange sightings in the woods. No one had seen him. No one had noticed anyone like him near that trail. Some dismissed our story as a combination of cabin fever, isolation, and overactive imaginations. Others listened, wide-eyed, but offered only a shrug and a warning about venturing too far from the beaten path. In the end, The lesson wasn't about danger from the wilderness, at least not in the conventional sense. It was about understanding that some encounters don't fit into neat explanations, that fear isn't always the result of visible threat, but of unanswerable presence. The man hadn't harmed us, hadn't demanded or taken, yet the memory of him lingered in a way that made every quiet forest, every falling snowflake, carry an echo of the unknown. Even now, I return to the mountains when I can, but I'm changed. The woods no longer feel like a place where I am the observer or the master of my surroundings. I feel their patience, their indifference, and the knowledge that not every story has a voice, not every presence needs an introduction. Sometimes when the wind bends just so through the pine boughs, I swear I hear him again. That hollow whisper carried over the frozen streams, reminding me that not all travelers announce themselves, not all visitors are meant to be understood, and that fear can exist even without action, silent, persistent, and waiting for the next curious soul to wander too far. The memory of that night stayed with me longer than any pain or scar could have. Driving back through the winding roads of Harlan County, the snow still clinging to the ridges, I felt an almost absurd compulsion to look into every shadow, to interpret every movement of the trees as a sign of him, the stranger who had no name, no story, and no reason to be there. Mark tried to lighten the mood with jokes about mountain ghosts, but I couldn't laugh. Lila, usually so grounded, sat quietly, her fingers tracing the edge of the dashboard as though trying to draw a protective line between us and the world we had left behind. We didn't speak much, each of us lost in our thoughts, replaying the encounter like a broken record. The strange certainty of his presence, the unnatural calm, the hollow eyes, the way he walked without disturbing the snow, refused to leave us. It wasn't a fear that demanded immediate action. It was a slow, insistent weight pressing into our awareness, a shadow that refused to dissipate with the return to normal life. Back home, the ordinary world seemed alien. The hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of traffic, even the mundane chatter at work felt intrusive, almost abrasive after the silence of those Appalachian woods. I found myself drifting into reveries about that night, imagining the stranger's path through the trees, wondering what he had witnessed, where he had come from, or where he had gone. Sleep became sporadic. Sometimes in the darkest hours I would awaken, convinced that the sound of footsteps or the faint echo of that hollow voice was just beyond the bedroom door. My friends reported similar experiences. Lila felt as though she was being watched when alone. Mark spoke of the lingering impression of eyes in the shadows. None of us saw him again, but his presence had infiltrated the fabric of our daily lives, as if the forest had followed us home, invisible but persistent. A few weeks later, curiosity drove me back toward Harlan County. I wanted to retrace the path we had hiked, to see if the footprints might appear again, or to discover some clue that could explain the man, some rational reason for what we had seen. The forest, now bare of snow, seemed familiar at first, but the moment I stepped off the main trail, the air thickened with that same heavy sense of observation I had felt in December. Every snap of a twig beneath my boots, every rustle of dry leaves made me flinch. I walked deeper, following no plan beyond a desire to confront the unease that had lodged in my chest. Hours passed, and the trail opened into that same clearing where we had camped. The earth was frozen solid, the faint smell of pine and decaying leaves hanging in the air. I expected nothing, and yet everything seemed charged, like the place had been holding its breath for me. I waited. I called out, my voice small and fragile against the vast stillness. No answer came. Nothing moved. And yet, deep in the shadows of the pines, I was sure of it. I was not alone. In the following months, the story became a quiet obsession. I researched local legends, reading accounts of winter wanderers, of solitary figures seen by hunters or hikers who vanished without trace. Some tales spoke of lost men who had wandered into the mountains and died. Others hinted at something more inexplicable, something that existed on the margins between human and spirit, observer and participant. None of it matched exactly what we had seen, and that was part of the terror. The stranger defied categorization, resisting the neat logic of folklore or myth. The fear was not in his actions. He had done nothing, but in the unshakable awareness that our world was not the only one operating within those mountains. There was a reality beyond sight and explanation, patient and silent, capable of observing without interference, and we had intruded upon it. Even now, years later, I carry a fragment of that winter night with me. I notice the silence differently, the way shadows gather under trees, the way wind carries patterns that seem almost deliberate. Camping is no longer just a pastime. It is a negotiation, a delicate understanding that the woods are alive in ways we may never perceive, that not all visitors announce themselves, and that some presences are measured not in threat but in the quiet insistence of being. I have returned to Harlan County several times since, each visit layered with anticipation and the faint, persistent hope of seeing him again, but each time he remains absent, leaving only the echo of his being, the footprints fading, the hollow eyes, the reminder that the world contains more than we can measure or explain. The strangest part, perhaps, is the clarity it left me with. Fear is not always a sign of danger, but a signal that something exists beyond understanding, that the universe carries witnesses whose presence is unfathomable and indifferent to our intrusion. I have come to accept that lesson quietly, in the same way one accepts the winter wind or the rhythm of snow falling in the mountains. The stranger did not harm us, did not speak beyond the necessary, did not demand our attention, but he changed us. He forced a confrontation with the unknown, a brush against the edges of perception where logic cannot reach. And sometimes in the stillness of the forest, when the fire is low and the shadows stretch long, I feel his watchful gaze again, and I remember that the world is far larger and stranger than I had ever believed, and that there are stories in the woods that will never be told. I never imagined that a simple weekend in the woods could leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about solitude and the wilderness, but May 2023 changed that forever. My name is Jordan Hayes, 28, a lifelong hiker and camper, someone who grew up on weekends in the Appalachians, sleeping under the canopy of oak and maple, listening to the wind carry secrets through the mountains. I had driven down to Ocoee Gorge in Tennessee, a place renowned for its roaring rivers, moss-covered rocks, and trails that dip into shadows where sunlight rarely touches. I went alone, as I usually do, seeking the quiet I thought I understood, the kind of stillness that comes before dawn or after sunset when the forest feels like it's breathing alongside you. But what I found was something entirely different, a pattern of unease I couldn't shake, an invisible presence that turned familiar ground into a maze of uncertainty. The first night, I set up camp on a narrow ledge above a bend in the river, a place I'd visited once as a teenager. The mud was soft from recent rains, and the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled the air. I thought I was prepared. Tent pitched taut, fire crackling, a kettle of water warming for instant coffee. But even as I sat there, the forest felt unusually silent. Not quiet, exactly, but tense, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The wind rustled through the treetops, but there were no distant animal calls, no frogs, no birds, just the occasional drip of water from a leaf punctuating the darkness. Around midnight, I decided to stretch my legs, following a narrow trail that hugged the gorge's edge. That's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh mud pressed into the ground, forming a trail that led away from my camp, curving and twisting unnaturally, like someone or something was walking in circles. At first, I told myself it must be an animal, a deer, or maybe another camper, but the prints were too precise, too human, yet strangely erratic. Each step seemed deliberate, but the pattern suggested confusion, a deliberate wandering with purpose that made no sense. I followed them cautiously, flashlight cutting through the thick darkness, and the smell of damp earth and pine intensified with each step. There was an eerie rhythm to it. Mud squelch, pause, squelch, pause, I could feel my pulse accelerate, the adrenaline warning me that I was too deep, too alone, yet something compelled me to keep moving, to trace the invisible story written in the mud. After about 10 minutes, the trail brought me back to a spot mere yards from my tent. The same prints circled back as if mocking my presence. I froze, heart hammering, breath misting in the cool night air, realizing that the forest had played with me. I remember feeling the uncanny sensation of being watched, not just by a hidden observer, but by the land itself. The Ocoee Gorge, in all its rugged majesty, felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and terrifying. I decided to stay put for the rest of the night, but sleep was impossible. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent me flinching. I felt as if eyes were on me from every shadow, though no one was there. Morning didn't bring relief. Mist curled over the river like smoke, and the forest seemed less menacing in daylight, but the footprints remained. More than that, they had multiplied overnight. Now there were dozens, some overlapping, all weaving in chaotic loops, crisscrossing, turning the land into a puzzle I could not solve. I followed one path cautiously, thinking maybe I could discover another camper who had come and gone, but the trail dissolved into the undergrowth. The closer I got to the river's edge, the more unsettled I became. Stones were overturned, twigs broken in ways that didn't align with the natural flow of animals or human hikers. And then I heard it, a soft, dragging sound from somewhere upstream, too measured to be wind, too irregular to be water alone. By the third day, I felt exhausted, mentally and physically. My sense of direction felt skewed. Trails that I had memorized seemed unfamiliar, the sun casting shadows where there should have been light. I began to notice subtle, almost imperceptible details, moss that appeared flattened as if something had lain there, small depressions in the mud that weren't footprints, and a faint, acrid smell that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to rationalize, perhaps another camper, perhaps a park ranger, perhaps my own imagination, but the circle of tracks that began and ended near my campsite defied logic. I made a small fire in the afternoon, trying to anchor myself in routine, and cooked a thin breakfast of granola and coffee, all while watching the tree line for movement that never came. The anxiety, slow and creeping, felt heavier than any physical exertion I had endured on the trails. The fourth night, a low fog rolled in from the river, thick enough to dampen the firelight and blur the edges of my tent. That's when I heard it again. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving in the mud outside, circling, overlapping, retreating, then returning. I gripped my flashlight and knife, peering into the gray veil, but the fog swallowed everything. Then I heard a whisper, almost carried on the wind, though the words were indistinct, fragmented, like half-remembered warnings. Don't go in circles. My rational mind screamed at me. No one could be out there. But the imprint of the previous nights haunted me. I knew instinctively that the forest in its quiet was testing me, probing the edges of my perception. And yet against every instinct I felt compelled to stand, to move, to confront whatever pattern had ensnared me. I stepped into the fog and mud, flashlight in hand, and began to trace the prints deliberately, marking my progress with sticks and stones. For nearly an hour, I followed the loops, circles, and erratic patterns. Every time I thought I had broken free, the prints seemed to adjust, always returning, always circling back to my own camp. Panic mingled with disbelief. I considered leaving entirely, but my gear and exhaustion anchored me. The forest had become a labyrinth designed not to trap the body but to disorient the mind. My breathing quickened, my heart pounded. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, and the wind whispered through the gorge as if it carried messages I couldn't understand. By the time I stumbled back to my tent, dawn was just beginning to pale the sky, and I realized the forest had let me return. Not out of mercy, but perhaps because it had grown curious about me, about my persistence, my fear, my humanity. That morning, I packed quickly, leaving most of my campsite behind. I took only essentials, following the main trail with eyes darting to every shadow, every mud patch, every stone that might conceal a secret. The footprints had stopped, as if they had been a test, a warning, a reminder that even a well-traveled forest holds corners no human should enter unprepared. As I drove away from Ocoee Gorge, the sunlight catching the river's whitewater, I felt a mix of relief and lingering unease. The forest behind me was quiet once more, yet the memory of the looping footprints and the fog-choked whispers remained. The incident forced me to confront my own sense of control in the wilderness. I had believed I understood fear, understood solitude, but the forest reminded me that nature has its own rhythm, one that does not bend to human expectations, one that can haunt you long after you leave its borders. By the time I returned home, I was consumed by reflection. Each time I close my eyes, I see the convoluted tracks in the mud, twisting endlessly, forming circles that go nowhere and everywhere at once. It became clear that the experience was not merely physical, but profoundly psychological. The forest revealed the limits of perception, the vulnerability of the human mind when faced with the unknown. And though I returned safely, the Ocoee Gorge had etched a lesson I could not ignore. Fear is not always a momentary spike of adrenaline. Sometimes it is a slow, creeping awareness that the world is far larger, stranger, and more intricate than we are prepared to comprehend. Even months later, when I recount the story to friends or fellow hikers, I can feel that same tightening in my chest, that uneasy shift in perception. The footprints in the fresh mud, endlessly circling, remain vivid in my memory. They were a reminder that the forest, in all its beauty, carries a quiet intelligence. It watches, it tests, and sometimes it leaves its mark not on your body, but on your mind, an imprint that refuses to fade, echoing in the silence long after the trees have disappeared from view.